Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, wherever you are. Thank you all for joining us. I hope all is well with you in these strange times. I'm Bernard Shelley from BSI. I work in the energy standards sector, and I'm manager of the BSI Technical Committee, which provides input to ISO TC67, the ISO committee, which has developed ISO 29001. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this BSI seminar, which I should note is being recorded, and you will be sent a follow-up email after the seminar with a copy of the recording. Thanks to those of you that have sent comments in advance. If you have any more as we go along, please post them using the Q&A function. We'll have time at the end to cover all we can. Slide, please. So today we're going to cover the history and the objectives of BSEN ISO 29001, an overview of ISO TC67, the Oil and Gas Standards Committees, key content of the standard, how ISO 29001 interfaces with other complementary quality management standards in the energy sector. Then we'll have time for a Q&A session answering both the pre-submitted questions and those posted during the webinar. And finally, we'll have a summary that will include supporting information and further guidance. And I'll now pass you on to Kevin Muller, who will introduce the speakers. Slide, please.
Just before I introduce the speakers, just a little bit of background. The standard's being developed by Workgroup 2 of the ISO committee responsible for oil and gas standards. The committee's got approximately 50 members from 15 countries, representing various sector organizations, including operators, suppliers, industry bodies, major contractors, etc. And around 20 of the membership were directly involved in supporting the new standard development, either in the core team or supporting members, or actually being on the commenting process. The panel members made up of myself, Kevin Muller. I'm the BSI Workgroup Chair, and I'm a core team member of ISO TC67 Workgroup 2. Philip Smedley, who's the BSI and ISO TC67 overall standards committee chair. So Philip deals with all the standards in the oil and gas activity. So we'll get his overview. And then Ted Fletcher, who was the leader and convener of Workgroup 2 in TC67 for this standard, will give a session. And finally, Kevin Mehta, who was also a core team member of the workgroup, will give you an introduction onto API and complementary standards. Next slide, please. I thought before we went through, it'd be worth going through a brief history of the standard. The standard was initially issued in 2003, so that's quite a long time ago, as a technical specification, and was last updated in 2010 to reflect the changes within ISO 9001-2008. I think following that update, it became much more widely used, especially around facilities design and construction activities, specialized engineering equipment, as well as general suppliers and products and services. And up until 2013, it was co-branded with API Q1, meaning that joint ISO 9001 certification was available until that time, which is something I'm sure people have comments on. Kevin Mehta will give more detail on this later. ISO 9001-2015 introduced a major step change really in the way that quality management systems are being implemented across all industries, focusing more on a process-driven approach, less on procedures, and focusing on identifying the risks and associated activities implementing the standard would need to take management processes for. In addition, the overall sector procurement practices have changed significantly in that time, with supply chains becoming much more complex, often requiring new technologies and global sourcing strategies from new areas. Next slide, please. Taking all this into account, the objectives when we were updating the standard were, number one, to fully align with 9001, 2015, and incorporate sector best practices for the oil and gas industry. And then, bearing in mind that it's all about managing risk, provide requirements and guidance to help organisations manage sector products and services risks and identify potential opportunities, with particular emphasis on assuring regulatory conformance, safety and reliability. And finally, a key area that we thought was important was to standardise a sector approach to try and minimise duplication and unnecessary complicated processes. Next slide, please. As part of the development, the team, we've collaborated very closely with key industry bodies and organisations, in particular the International Association of Oil and Gas Producers, a number of supply chain joint industry projects, which were looking at standardisation and how risks are managed within the oil and gas industry. The American Petroleum Institute, API. Another key area that we've been working with is the ISO Committee on Conformity Assessment. And in particular, they've got a new document which is worth looking at, which is all in this particular area on delivering supply chain confidence. I think it dovetails very well into the way that 29001 works. And finally, looking at capital facilities handover specifications, trying to standardize and minimize information management requirements. Following this, really now, I'll just hand over to Philip Smedley, who's been the BSI and ISO committee chair for the development of all sector standards and a particular supporter of this standard. Over to you, Philip. Next slide, please.
Yep. Thank you, Kevin. As Kevin just said, I'm Philip Smedley. I work for BP here in the UK, and I'm speaking to you in my role as both the chairman of the ISO Technical Committee, TC67, which covers the standards for the oil and gas industry, and also in my role as chairman of the UK Mirror Committee to ISO TC67, which is called BSI PSE 17. So these acronyms crop up quite a lot, I'm afraid, through the meeting. Just to put it in context, ISO 9001 sets out the criteria for a quality management system, and over 1 million organizations in over 170 countries are now certified to ISO 9001. So recognizing the importance of this quality standard and also our industry sector, ISO gave permission for the development of an oil and gas sector-specific quality standard, the ISO 29001 that we're talking about today. And we were given special permission to almost uniquely reproduce the text within ISO 9001 along dictionary quotes. And Ted, the next speaker, is going to show an illustration of that in his presentation. You can see on the screen that ISO's got some 250 technical committees which cover topics from road vehicles to cosmetics. And almost all of the 24,000 standards that have been published by ISO have safety and quality at their heart. So for petroleum, petrochemicals and natural gases, I oversee the development of 219 standards within ISO TC67. Most of these deal with specific asset types, such as equipment, pipelines, offshore structures, piping, and floating LNG. Our next speaker, Ted Fletcher of Woodside in Australia, leads one of our important cross-discipline work groups, and as such, we're collectively promoting the value and use of ISO 29001 within our own sector-specific ISO standards. Importantly, in ISO TC67, the default is for our international standards to be adopted in parallel in Europe as EN standards. And soon after this happens, all EU countries also adopt them as the national standards. Thus, the cover page in the UK is the BSEN ISO 29001. And adoption means that this standard is now the sole UK and European standard covering the topic within its scope. I've got a link on the bottom of the page. I'll put that into the chat box. You can go there after the webinar and have a look at some of the more detail of the broad work that we're doing in ISO TC67. And as this work, just to wrap up, as the work in ISO is managed via the national standards bodies such as BSI in the UK, Bernard Shelley, who's leading this webinar, is the go-to person for anyone wishing to get involved as the UK expert in any of the work on the oil and gas standards. So with that, I'll now pass over to Ted Fletcher, who's going to talk in more detail about his ISO work group. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Phil. It's quite a important event for us tonight in terms of starting to talk about the development of 29001 and the implementation of 29001. I think on the screen now we've got the ISO homepage, and on that we talk about Workgroup 2, Operating Integrity Management, which is the work group who's responsible for 29001, but also importantly Workgroup 4 that looks at reliability engineering and technology. And these two work groups are quite unique within TC67 that they are not writing the technical standards or the technical requirements. We are very much writing the enabling standards in managing the implementation of the technical requirements. So we play quite an important role within the overall TC67 family of committees and work groups. I had the pleasure of being the convener of the work group for, I think, coming up for 5 years, and we've been supported by Jano Darkhurst as our secretary in facilitating the process to turn a lot of discussion into meaningful standards at the end of the day. You'll see on screen, you'll see a QR code which will take you to our website with more detail. If you go to the next slide, please. So a little bit of background to the portfolio of standards that we look after. Firstly, there is clearly a European, Netherlands and Australian connection. When I joined the work group, I didn't know that it was looking for a convener, and somehow, I guess because of my passion for this subject, I ended up with that role. As Kevin indicated, we had some 50 members, active members from 15 countries, and we work with a lot of the liaison groups in terms of API, the drilling contractors, IAGP, IPECA, Energy Institute, etc. There are 5 standards that are published, and the top left-hand there within our roadmap is 29001. We are also working on a sector operating management system standard, which takes the concept of operating management systems, and some people talk of integrated management systems. Within our space, we prefer to talk about, if you like, a discipline agnostic operating management system for the companies within our sector in terms of operators and the principal supply chain. So 29010 will be going out for draft public review early in the new year, and we're also working on standards to complement the work we've done on 29001. And importantly, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later, that we need a scheme for what are the protocols and what are the competencies to give meaningful independent assessment of conformance with 29001, but very much to demonstrate that it's delivering the value. Within our sector, and I guess in a lot of sectors, there's a lot of skepticism about certification. Everybody accepts it as a baseline in terms of for your supply chain selection. What we're looking to do is to make sure certification to 29001 will give that added confidence and reduce the need for the operators and the members of the supply chain to do their own assessments on top of the certification assessment. So we see that piece of work that we're moving into now as very important in terms of that. We are also, in conjunction with looking at the operating management system, we see that very much as a document which will be about benchmarking within the sector rather than necessarily certification within the sector. So we've kicked off a process now for looking at assessing the maturity of implementation and ultimately what is the value the operating management system is delivering to the business. So we're getting close to World Quality Day on the 12th of November, and that is about, you know, value to the customer. And within our sector, we're looking about the quality management system creating value, protecting value, and then enhancing value in the life cycle of our assets. And I guess the last piece of work, and it's we have one standard that was published in 2000 called ISO TR 13881, which is actually the foundation for Annex C within 29001, and it's a system that looks at conformity assessment and independent conformity assessment and that delivering value and assurance to the supply chain. And we're about to kick off a revision of that, which will be an aid or supplement to implementation in 29001. So again, as I said, visit our website. We're looking to publish a lot of supporting commentary and guidance to support implementation of the standard there. So if you move forward to the next standard, please. Next slide, please. So what does the standard look like? And clearly on this 1 hour session, this cannot be a 29001 one-on-one, but the key principles that we've worked to is that our sector sees specific risks. It's high risk, it's regulatory risks and license to operate risks. So 9001, although a very good foundation standard, doesn't give us that sector specific detail that we were looking for. So that was the original concept of the co-branded 29001 and APIQ1 if you go back 10 years. So the principle is that we're not reinventing the wheel. We only supplement 9001 where it's justified on the basis of our sector's context and risks. And you know, there's an assumption here that everybody is very familiar with 9001, 2015, and the concept of context and associated risks is fundamental to successful implementation of 9001, and our strategy has been to write a standard that builds that context into the requirements. Importantly, Q1 and Q2, which are the primary complementary quality management system standards, they are very important within the sector, and we wanted to bridge 9001, 29000, Q1, Q2. And Kevin Mehta will talk a little bit more about that relationship later in this presentation. The last piece of the discussion is very much around standardizing the way we implement a requirement standard such as 29001 in our sector. Historically, we are a very bespoke sector. We take an international standard and then we individually as organizations look to supplement it, add to it, and do something different. And that doesn't necessarily add value, but it certainly adds cost and schedule implications to the sector. So within we'll talk to in a little piece about Annex C, we're looking to provide a way of standardizing the tools used to implement the standard. Now, in terms of where do you go for more information, on the website, following the QR code, you'll find that we've developed correlation matrices that relate 29001 2020 back to the 2010 version, and importantly also cross-reference to the current Q1 and Q2. So for those of you who are looking to map your systems, those matrices will help with that discussion. There's a guidance document that helps to understand where should 29001 be applied, where is a 9001 system adequate for elements of our supply chain, and where, if you're very sector specific and delivering to, for example, API specifications, where Q1 and Q2 is appropriate for the quality requirements for that scope of supply. And also within that site, we've actually explained the rationale for each of the requirements, each of the supplementary requirements. Now, the last piece of that discussion, buried within the text of the document itself, there's two occasions where there is a link back to standardsiso.org 29001. And on that site, you can go and find the two tools that we've developed to support implementation of Annex C of the requirement. And if we could just move to the next slide, please. So just a simple example of the way the document works. And as Phil said, that we basically take the base 9001 scope and following the ISO drafting rules, we just supplement the text. And in some places, the supplement is as simple as requiring that the process to address that requirement is documented, or there are records or information maintained to demonstrate implementation of that. And in this case, the first example in terms of scope, it's simply a statement that it's a standard that's designed specifically to address the risks within our sector. If we just move to the next slide. So what we thought we'd do tonight is talk more about, not about the detailed changes in the requirements, because for most of you that will be a fairly straightforward, this is what 9001 says, this is what 29001 says, and using the rationale that will be quite clear. What we'd like to talk about for a few minutes before I hand over to Kevin is talk about the complexity of our supply chain. And Annex C within 29001 has been written to provide a methodology that can be applied for understanding what you're doing within the supply chain. And we talked about this concept of the cascading contract model. And if you're in the role of an operator, and I represent an operator, that an operator may engage the supply chain at any level within that supply chain. Some people think of operators very much engaging management consultants or execution EPC, EPIC contractors. But the reality is that within operations, we will be also engaging directly with material and component suppliers. So it's fairly complicated, or can be complicated. So we need procurement systems that can accommodate that complexity. And the important thing also is that your risk may be way down the supply chain. So as operators, you need transparency of the supply chain, and you need to know when you need to apply, based on risk, oversight of perhaps you've placed an order at a packager. Contractually, the packager is responsible. From a risk perspective, you may want further oversight of where they're getting their components. And you could have an example of very high risk forgings or castings that go into subsea ballast, for example. So it's about having a system that lets you identify the risks, understand the capability within the supply chain, and then applying that. So if we just go to the next slide, and I will try not to take too much time, but basically in Annex C, we've simply workflowed the intent of 9001, 29001, and anybody familiar with 9001 will see the core clauses within the standard in terms of operational planning and control, where the supplier, having received a scope of work from their purchaser, needs to go through their assessment, understanding of customer requirements, understand the risks, and build their operational plans and their controls to mitigate and manage those risks. Key question is then, what elements of the scope will be done internally and what elements will be done externally? And if you think back to the cascading contracting model, this principle, this workflow can be applied at any point within the supply chain. And it's basically going through that logic. And if you're at the top of the supply chain, you need to work out where you want visibility going down the supply chain. So if we just follow the external route for a moment, if you know what you're going to outsource, you need to write clear scopes of work with clearly defined requirements. And importantly, within standard speak these days, is a verifiable requirement. Do you actually have something that you can then validate, verify, and confirm that you've met those requirements? The next piece in the discussion is, who are your potential suppliers and what is their capability? Traditionally, our risk or criticality tools that are used in the sector talk about the service risk or the execution risk. They tend not to consider the actual differentials in the supply chain. So you may have a low risk commodity that you're purchasing, but you're dealing with a high risk supply chain. So although in theory it's not a high risk or highly complicated commodity that you're purchasing, where you're purchasing it from may expose you to schedule risks or conformity risks that may be a small item that could have a big impact on schedule and ultimately cost. So that's key differentiator, that we're looking to look at service risk and then look at supply chain risk. And then the rest is, as you would expect, you go out to tender, you've got a scope, you've got a set of quality requirements, you do a risk assessment, technical bid evaluation, and select who the supplier or provider is going to be. And then based on that assessment, you determine the level of intervention that you will apply within the supply chain. And then you execute the work, you respond as required following normal practices. And one of the subtleties is that depending on where you are in the supply chain, you may be releasing those commodities or items or services back into your organization, or you might be releasing them direct to a customer. And you just need to follow those processes. If you move to the next slide, please. And if we, just on that note, we want to talk more about NFC shortly, but we'd like just to have a brief discussion on the the complementary standards, and I'll hand over to Kevin Mehta just to lead that discussion.
Thank you, Ted. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. So I'm just going to talk about a few of the complementary quality management system or QMS standards that are out there today, like ISO 9001. This one we're talking about 29001, API Q1 and Q2. Some of the differences between Q1 and Q2, the strategies we used in developing 29001, and some of the next steps that'll be going on looking at all these different standards. So one thing I want to bring your attention to on here is this graphic. So you can see here, we've got obviously the core ISO 9001 standards, we've got 29001 standards, and the API Q1 and Q2 requirements, which are combined for the ease of the graph. There really is some minor differences between those two as well. So the main thing to note here is that while nothing is directly overlapping between the three, both of the 29001 and Q1 and Q2 cover 9001, and then they mostly have the same overlaps themselves with some minor differences between 29001 and Q1 and Q2. As part of the development of 29001, a correlation matrices was made between 29001 2020, 29001 the previous edition, API Q1 9th edition, and API Q2 1st edition. So that is that correlation matrices link that is there and will be in the slide deck that will be sent out to you all. Next slide, please. So one of the first things I kind of want to mention, and I know a lot of y'all are not from the US, you can tell from my accent that I am. There are some differences between API Q1 and Q2. So the two standards have a kind of a rough delineation where API Q1 is focused on manufacturing activities or products, and API Q2 is focused on the service execution activities. And I know there's some confusion about that. So this is a graphic that API has worked on and has been developed in some of the different sessions as we've been working on some of these standards. And you can kind of see how they're covered. So you've got the Q1 covers manufacturing, Q2 has service supply centers and rig and well sites. You'll notice there is some overlap, primarily with refurbishment and remanufacture. That can be covered in Q1 or Q2. And so depending on the site, depending on what else is going on, could identify which API standard, Q1 or Q2, it is that a site might need to qualify for or certify to, depending on what they're looking for. Obviously, 29001 is a more overarching standard and does look to cover both manufacturing and service execution activities. But it was important to delineate that from the API side. Q1 and Q2 do have some different windows. Next slide, please. Thank you. So originally, when we developed 29001 2020, we did have a strategy document that was put together. And so there's some verbiage that was in that strategy document. It's a little funky. Admittedly, it's a lot of speak specific to when you develop standards. But the goal was of 29001 that if you are compliant to a standard like Q1 or Q2, that should meet the relevant requirements of 29001. So, which raises the question of which one would I need? Q1, Q2, 29001, 9001. How do you know which one to get? And the answer to that is, it depends. If you're trying to get API 6A monogram or a license or something like that, then API will require that you have Q1, or it may, depending on if your customers require Q1 or Q2, that may also be a requirement. Same with 29001. 9001 is kind of that base QMS requirements, kind of gives you, the basic level of where you can be, and then each of these other ones, as Ted mentioned earlier, 29001 is 9001 plus supplement requirements. Q1 and Q2, while worded differently, have a similar kind of concept. It is 9001. If you are Q1, you'll meet 9001. It just has different requirements in there and a different way of doing things. So which one to get? It's really up to you, your business, who your customers are, what your customers require, the regulatory requirements in the area you work in. There are a lot of things that answer. So there is no one-size-fits-all question for which one works for you in that regard. There was a guidance document created by TC67 Workgroup 2 for the use of 29001 2020. That's that QR code there that you can click on that to learn a little bit more. Next slide, please. Thank you. So some of the next steps going on right now. So for those of you who are not aware, API is currently developing the 10th edition of Q1 and the 2nd edition of Q2. When those editions are ready, they'll go out to ballot to the API committees, and the committees will review the comments and the ballots, and then they may go out to a second ballot depending on the initial responses. So that process is ongoing right now. API is engaged in joining the TC67 and IOGP groups to kind of be involved in that. Obviously, for those of you who are API registered companies, you are aware that API is the one who does your registration. They are currently monitoring the adoption of the industry of 29001 to determine if it should be included in the QR program in the future. The ISO TC67 group is engaging with API as they're working on the 29001 certification scheme, so that's something that's just getting started. And obviously, as most of you should be aware or are aware, there is a user survey out right now on ISO 9001 to decide if it should be confirmed, the existing version to continue, or it should be revised. And API is obviously one of the organizations that will be providing input on that survey for what ISO should be doing with 9001. And with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Ted, and he will continue from here.
Thanks, Kevin. We'd just like to take the next few minutes to talk about an implementation case study of the principles within 29001. And the reality is that the work within IOGP Jp33 was going in parallel with the finalisation of 29001/2020. So they were, if you like, going through some iterative discussions in the development of the standard. And Jp33 is very much about our sector, which historically is very bespoke, as I mentioned before, looking to standardise our technical requirements. And within that model, there was early recognition that differences in technical requirements create cost and schedule implications, but more also importantly, differences in quality requirements and information requirements also create those differences. So encourage everybody to visit the Jp33 website and have a look at what's happening within the sector in trying to get a very bespoke operator-specific industry to work to a common set of requirements. And importantly, within that, there's recognition that the base should always be the international standard, and we all should always work towards the international standard. But as innovation occurs and as work practices change, sometimes the industry is ahead of where the standards are. So Jp33 actually complements and in many ways has an opportunity to speed the development of the international standards. So if we can go to the next slide, and I'll just briefly talk to the Jp33 framework. It's very much a question of taking a very bespoke industry that we all as operators think we're special and that our opportunity is different and therefore our requirements should be different. And although as a sector, we very much contribute to the work of the standards organisations within API, within ISO, within our various country standards bodies, we then tend to go and write our own bespoke company specifications and often project-specific specifications. So this slide is really just talking about the opportunity here and the collaborative approach in the work that's going on. And I had the pleasure of being involved in this initiative from its inception back in 2014, where the operators came together to talk about it. It's very challenging, but we believe it's a powerful way forward for the sector, and it's got high level of support within the executives, within the operators within our sector. And I just encourage you to go to the website. If we just go to the next slide. So the simple framework, it's very much about taking a base industry standard which the supply chain is used to working to, and in many cases has had a key involvement in the development of those standards. And then looking at what is the minimum set of technical requirements that we as purchasers, operators should add to that in terms of standardizing decisions, because quite often the standards will have a lot of variability in them, or where we see technical risk in concepts of process safety or operating integrity that we believe needs to be covered within the technical requirements. So that's the baseline approach, minimum overlay to the best practice industry standard. And then we define the application of the standard and the supplementary requirements through what we call an equipment data sheet. So our concept is that our engineers spend time doing engineering and populating the data sheet rather than writing bespoke specifications. So that's our principle. Added to that, we then have a process for looking at what the technical risks are, what needs to be verified, validated, in order to demonstrate the requirements are met, and also to demonstrate that any associated regulatory requirements are met, and that's where the quality requirement specification comes in. And then the final piece of the puzzle is very much about what information do we require from the supply chain, initially to demonstrate their capability and what their offer is, and then to manage the execution of the work scope. And that's where what we call the information requirement specification fits in. And These documents have lots of different names within our sector. Quality requirements are called many different things. Information requirements are called SDRLs, EDRLs, BDDRs. So we elected to take a simple definition, which we hope is future-proofed in terms of their quality requirements and their information requirements. If we just go to the next slide, and we'll just connect the dots back to ISO 29001. Within that ISO standards maintenance portal, which we mentioned earlier, there's two templates there. One is the risk assessment process, where we're looking to standardize certainly how the operators and the principal EPCs undertake risk and criticality assessments for the supply chain. And the delta there from the historical approach, which was very much a semi-quantitative process based on a numbering scheme, we've moved its related back to the risk matrix. So whatever the risk context of the opportunity is, or the development or the procurement activity is, we relate it to the risk, what's important from a risk perspective, and we go through from a consequence, and then we look at likelihood in respect to the design maturity, the complexity of manufacture, and then we look at the supply chain. So we encourage you to have a look at that tool and see how it works in terms of applying risk-based thinking to how we assess the risk from a service risk, and then also from a supply chain risk within the system. The other piece of the work is, and this is where we've really connected to the approach within Casco and the concept of conformity assessment systems, and also back to that 13881 standard, where we are looking to standardize the level of intervention across the operators, so that mature suppliers with a mature offering, there should be minimal risk and minimal intervention by the purchaser. And that's what we call a Cascading level of intervention, which should be the bare minimum required consistent with the assessed risk. Whereas if you've got a very immature relationship, a novel product with a supply chain you're not familiar with, you'll clearly have more intervention in the way you engage with the supply chain. And this concept is very much about having an understanding between the core purchasers within our sector and the supply chain of what level of intervention that will have, because it has a big impact on contingencies in terms of schedule and cost. So what I'll do now is just move on to the next slide. And this has very much been a snapshot of this process. And one of the things we'd like to do is engage further based on the feedback to the seminar. So I'll hand back to Kevin now to wrap up and move into the Q&A.
Thanks, Ted. So just before we move into the Q&A, we need to get along with that. Just summarising, I think the key areas we've looked at around alignment with 2015 9001 and sector best practices. I think it was a key area, key to managing the significant risks that we've got in the oil and gas industries, and a big focus on standardization and collaboration across the industry with all the relevant organizations. And the key to all this is really about driving improvement to protect and create value in the industry. It's really important, and as Kevin Met has brought out, it's very important to continue our collaboration with API. But I'll move on quickly to the Q&A session. There were a number of questions submitted beforehand, and throughout the session I can see there's quite a few more being put forwards. I'll try and take as many as those as I can, but it's what time allows for. But I assure you all questions will be answered over the coming days. So moving on to questions that were pre-submitted, I think it's only fair because people took on there. The first question that came up was will BSI make this an accredited scheme in the near future? Well, I'll hand over to Bernard in a second on that one, but essentially BSI already certified to 29001, as do a number of other certification bodies. Have you got anything else to add to that, Bernard?
No, I just suggest that if anybody wants any specific detail, that if they make contact with me, I can put them in touch with either the BSI quality team or give them some other suggestions.
Another question that came up on the pre-submitted, what are the differences with API Q1, Q2 and 29001? And is there any possibility to merge these standards into a single document? Did mention previously up until 2013, I apologise. The previous edition of 29001 was co-branded, but time's moved on. Kevin, have you got any comments on there, Kevin Mehta?
No, so I mean, the way the question was worded, it wasn't clear if they were asking about if Q1 and Q2 would be combined or if it was a Q1, Q2, 29001. So Q1 and Q2, no, API is keeping those as two separate standards. There's work, as I mentioned, going on in the 10th edition of Q1 and the 2nd edition of Q2. As far as 29001 goes, as API is getting engaged in ISO TC 67 and IOGP, we will see down the line as that engagement and working together improves what happens with 29001 moving forward.
Okay. Another question that came up, how does 29001 integrate with the principles of ISO 45001? And are there plans for a lead auditor role for this standard? So I think there's two questions there. Ted, probably if you take the question on how does it integrate with 45001?
Okay, thanks, Kevin. As most of you would be aware, there is at least 30 different ISO management system standards that are modelled on the high-level structure. Within our work group, I mentioned briefly that we're working on a document which will become ISO 29010, or an operating management system. We have mapped every management system standard to that document, and 45001, the principles are the same. You set the context of your organisation, you understand your risks, and you'll have risks that are related to delivery, to the conformance of your outputs, and you'll have risks that are related to, from a process safety perspective and from a personal health and safety perspective, that should be built into your system. Our view, very much in looking at 29010, is that you should design your management system to meet your business context, its risks, and your operations, and you should map to whichever of the management system standards adds value to your organisation in the context of that risk. So they should be harmonised, and there should not be a health system and a safety system and an environment system and a quality system and an asset management system. There should be one management system that meets the needs of the business in the context of those requirements. Were you, Kevin, did you want me to answer the question about the lead auditor role?
You can do that as well. Yeah, go ahead.
So again, a plug for work that we're doing. The key aspect for us is having written the standard, how effectively is it implemented, and can we have confidence in a supplier who says the context of their organisation, they've gone beyond 9001 and they've met 29001, and equally Q1 or Q2. It's very much around the competence of the people in the organisation who are facilitating the development of that system and doing internal assessments or audits. But when you go second party or third party, we want to be sure that the competence is there and there's a common protocols for doing it. And that's where we will be writing this standard, building on the Cascading 17020 model with that context for the sector. And we're also benchmarking with other sectors. We know similar schemes within automotive and aerospace, and we're also having close collaboration with the nuclear sector, who have a similar high-risk, heavily regulated area. So we believe that this is an area of work, and we are would welcome anybody who would like to participate and add value to that work.
Okay. Another one here that came in whilst we've been online is how many organisations have currently been certified to 29001 in the world? That's quite a big ask. We'll try and get back to you on that one, but I think we couldn't answer that here. Certainly, it's been quite popular as far as certification in the past. So we'll get back to you on that one. The next one is, go ahead, Ted.
I was just going to say that, you know, it's very clear that there's been a big gap between the issue of 9001/2015 and the publication of this standard. So part of the work we're doing is to demonstrate the value of the standard, and it'll be about the value of the standard both to the supply chain and the value seen by the operators in whether they mandate it, or it's more a question of understanding that even a 9001 sector certification or 9001 certification in the context of our sector, 29001 is the roadmap to meeting the context and the risks of our sector. Back to you, Kevin.
Right, another one that's come in here is staying with the 29001 theme. There's quite a number coming in on 29010 operating management system. I think we best take those ones offline because otherwise it'll get quite deep. Does it mean that an organisation can replace its existing 9001 with ISO 29001, or does the organisation need to maintain both? From my perspective, really, and I hope it came across in this session, that 29001 contains all the requirements of 9001 with supplementary requirements and guidance. So having the co-branded certification, you know, a co-certification for both probably would be the way ahead. Has anybody else got anything else to say to that? Ted or Kevin Mehta?
No, I think that would.
Yeah.
So I think what you said is pretty clear. I mean, basically, if you get 29001, you are meeting 9001 because 29001 is 9001 plus supplemental requirements. So it is the more detailed standard.
And agree with both comments 100%. One of the considerations is, although we think we're a very big sector and a very important sector, there are elements of the supply chain where we purchase that we are only a small part of the sales of an organisation, so that within that context, they may have 9001 certification, and that may be adequate within the context of that commodity. But as soon as you move into a high risk scenario, that's where we would be looking for 29001.
Okay, a very similar question, which we just sort of put together with this one. Can organisations be certified only to 29001? Again, I think we've answered that one. 29001 automatically would cover 9001 anyway, so because it's contained the same area. Looking through the questions. Quite a few of the questions are statements, so we'll just come back and we'll answer those as separate online. One question here is, how would an organisation that only deals with inspection services utilise 29001? Again, I guess that's similar, is looking at what are the risks in your organisation if you're dealing with the oil and gas industry. The guidance that we give on Workgroup 2 website gives you guidance on how to decide if your organisation should stay with 9001 only or 29001. And I think if you follow that flow process, it would give you the answer for your specific organisation without getting into vast detail. Have you got anything else on there, Ted?
I guess I would just comment that I have a very simple view of the world, that when you are looking at 9001 and you look at the context of your organisation and the risks, and when you're looking at your service offer, following the principles of 9001, the add-ons of 29001 will help you when you're dealing with the sector. So whether you think 9001 or 29001, the answer will be the same in what is your customer required, what is the level of confidence, and can you demonstrate that you're addressing the risks that they see in using your services.
Right. One final question I'll take before we get to the final summary, because time runs out. But again, all of the questions that have been submitted we'll come back to. Question here: in these difficult times, cost cutting is a high priority, especially for activities that are not seen as market driven. 29001 certification may be perceived as one such cost. And the question is around what do we believe on self-declaration rather than certification? It's a long question, and we can come back to that in writing, but I think in the short term, I don't think we're saying that you need to be certified, whilst it would be certainly an advantageous situation in some cases. The key part is really that 29001 is there for you to have conformance as an organisation, and then decide on your own merits if you want certification. Again, Ted, have you got anything for that?
I think the only perfect answer, Kevin, but a declaration versus demonstration of conformance. So from a purchaser's point of view, we want you to demonstrate how you conform and how you've addressed the risks specific to the scope of supply you're offering. So a declaration would not be enough. What we're looking for is objective evidence of how effective your system is.
Yeah. And I think that's, as part of declaration, that's something that should take place. I'll just do one final one, because on this thing of certification comes through. How many certification bodies are currently able to offer 29001 certification? My understanding is the majority of organisations are offering it and are certifying to it. We haven't got the actual numbers, but we'll try and find out. Right. On that one, because time is running short, can we move to the next slide, please? I'll hand over to Bernard Shelley just to do a close out here before we run out of time.
Thanks very much for that, Kevin. I think that's been a good hour's worth, a very thorough introduction to BSE and ISO 29001 and its importance to our industry. You can always get more information on the standard through ISO and BSI websites and through your own national standards bodies. And BSI QA, among others, of course, can help with auditing. We heard earlier that ISO TC67WG2 is also working on a new operating management standard and assessment schemes for both 29001 and the OMS standard, and also on the revision of ISO TR 13881. So please let us know if you would like to participate in this work. My email address is included somewhere if you want to use me as your main point of contact. So it just remains for me to thank you all very much for attending, and in particular thanks to our speakers from across the world, Kevin Muller, Philip Smedley, Ted Fletcher, and Kevin Mehta. Thank you very much, everybody, and goodbye.